1960s.
The 1960s was a decade that began on January 1, 1960 and ended on December 31, 1969. The 1960s term also refers to an era more often called the 60s, denoting the complex of interrelated cultural and political trends across the globe. This cultural decade is more loosely defined than the actual decade, beginning around 1963 and ending around 1974. The 60s, as they are known in both scholarship and popular culture, is a term used by historians, journalists, and other objective academics. In some cases nostalgically to describe the counterculture and revolution in social norms about clothing, music, drugs, dress, formalities, and schooling. Conservatives denounce the decade as one of irresponsible excess, flamboyance, and decay of social order. The decade was also labeled the swinging 60s because of the fall or relaxation of social taboos especially relating to racism and sexism that occurred during this time. The 1960s became synonymous with the new, radical, and subversive events and trends of the period. In Africa the 1960s was a period of radical political change as 32 countries gained independence from their European colonial rulers. Commentator Christopher Booker described this era as a classical Jungian nightmare cycle, where a rigid culture, unable to contain the demands for greater individual freedom, broke free of the social constraints of the previous age through extreme deviation from the norm. He charts the rise, success, full nightmare and explosion in the London scene of the 1960s. However, this analysis fails to explain the mass nature of the phenomenon. Several nations such as the US, France, Germany and Britain turned to the left in the early and mid-1960s. In the United States, John F. Kennedy, a Keynesian and staunch anti-communist, pushed for social reforms. His assassination in 1963 was a stunning shock. Liberal reforms were finally passed under Lyndon B. Johnson including civil rights for African Americans and health care for the elderly and the poor. Despite his large-scale Great Society programs, Johnson was increasingly reviled by the New Left at home and abroad. The heavy-handed American role in the Vietnam War outraged student protesters across the globe, as they found peasant rebellion typified by Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara more appealing. For example, American cities began to witness Black Panther Party chapter proliferation, an organization characterized with black nationalist and Maoist undertones, began to offer free health clinics, breakfast programs for schoolchildren, free clothing facilities, busing to prisons with families of incarcerated individuals, and self-defense classes for minorities subjected to police harassment. In Western Europe and Japan, organizations such as those present at May 1968, the Red Army faction, and the Zonghakuren tested liberal democracy's ability to satisfy its marginalized or alienated citizenry amidst post-industrial age hybrid capitalist economies. Italy formed its first left-of-center government in March 1962 with a coalition of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and moderate Republicans. Socialists joined the ruling bloc in December 1963. In Britain, the Labour Party gained power in 1964. In Brazil, João Goulart became president after Jânio Quadros resigned. The assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. upon working with underpaid Tennessee garbage collectors and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the police response towards protesters of the 1968 Democratic National Convention defined politics of violence in the United States.
Politics and wars. Wars.
The Cold War. The Vietnam War, 1959 to 1975. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam, 1962. By mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963. By the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. The Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War, 1966. After 1966 with the draft in place, more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles to invade southern Cuba with support from U.S. government armed forces, to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. Portuguese Colonial War, 1961–1974, the war was fought between Portugal's military and the emerging nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies. It was a decisive ideological struggle and armed conflict of the Cold War in African, Portuguese Africa and surrounding nations, and European, mainland Portugal, scenarios. Unlike other European nations, the Portuguese regime did not leave its African colonies, or the overseas provinces, during the 1950s and 1960s. During the 1960s, various armed independence movements, most prominently led by communist-led parties who cooperated under the CONCP umbrella and pro-US groups, became active in these areas, most notably in Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. During the war, several atrocities were committed by all forces involved in the conflict: the Vietnam War, 1959–1975. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam, 1962. By mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963, by the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. The Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War, 1966. After 1966 with the draft in place, more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam, 1962. By mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963, by the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. The Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War, 1966. After 1966 with the draft in place more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles to invade southern Cuba with support from U.S. government armed forces, to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. Portuguese Colonial War, 1961–1974. The war was fought between Portugal's military and the emerging nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies. It was a decisive ideological struggle and armed conflict of the Cold War in African, Portuguese Africa and surrounding nations, and European, mainland Portugal, scenarios. Unlike other European nations, the Portuguese regime did not leave its African colonies, or the overseas provinces, during the 1950s and 1960s. During the 1960s, various armed independence movements, most prominently led by communist-led parties who cooperated under the CONCP umbrella and pro-US groups, became active in these areas, most notably in Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. During the war, several atrocities were committed by all forces involved in the conflict. Pakistan and India went to war in September 1965. Arab-Israeli conflict, early 20th century present. 6 Days War, June 1967, a war between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Arab states of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria also contributed troops and arms. At the war's end, Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The results of the war affect the geopolitics of the region to this day. 6 Days War, June 1967, a war between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Arab states of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria also contributed troops and arms. At the war's end, Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The results of the war affect the geopolitics of the region to this day. The Algerian War came to a close in 1962. The Nigeria Civil War began in 1967.
Internal conflicts.
Cultural Revolution in China, 1966–1976, a period of widespread social and political upheaval in the People's Republic of China which was launched by Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China. Mao alleged that liberal bourgeois elements were permeating the party and society at large and that they wanted to restore capitalism. Mao insisted that these elements be removed through post-revolutionary class struggle by mobilizing the thoughts and actions of China's youth, who formed Red Guards groups around the country. The movement subsequently spread into the military, urban workers, and the party leadership itself. Although Mao himself officially declared the Cultural Revolution to have ended in 1969, the power struggles and political instability between 1969 and the arrest of the Gang of Four in 1976 are now also widely regarded as part of the revolution. The troubles in Northern Ireland began with the rise of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s. The conflict continued into the later 1990s. The Compton's cafeteria riot occurred in August 1966 in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. This incident was one of the first recorded transgender riots in United States history, preceding the more famous 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City by 3 years. The Stonewall riots occurred in June 1969 in New York City. The Stonewall riots were a series of spontaneous, violent demonstrations against a police raid that took place in the Stonewall Inn, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. They are frequently cited as the first instance in American history when people in the homosexual community fought back against a government-sponsored system that persecuted sexual minorities, and they have become the defining event that marked the start of the gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. The May 1968 student and worker uprisings in France, mass socialist or communist movement in most European countries, particularly France and Italy, with which the student-based New Left was able to forge a connection. The most spectacular manifestation of this was the May Student Revolt of 1968 in Paris that linked up with a general strike of 10 million workers called by the trade unions, and for a few days seemed capable of overthrowing the government of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle went off to visit French troops in Germany to check on their loyalty. Major concessions were won for trade union rights, higher minimum wages and better working conditions. University students protested in the hundreds of thousands against the Vietnam War in London, Paris, Berlin and Rome. In Eastern Europe, students also drew inspiration from the protests in the West. In Poland and Yugoslavia, they protested against restrictions on free speech by communist regimes. The Tlatelolco massacre was a government massacre of student and civilian protesters and bystanders that took place during the afternoon and night of October 2, 1968, in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in the Tlatelolco section of Mexico City.
Coups.
Prominent coups d'état of the decade included: in 1963, a coup in South Vietnam leads to the death of President Ngo Dinh Diem and the establishment of temporary military rule. On April 21, 1967, in Greece, a group of colonels established a military dictatorship for 7 years. In 1968, a coup in Iraq led to the overthrow of Abdul Rahman Arif by the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. On September 1, 1969, a small group of military officers led by the army officer Muammar Gaddafi overthrows monarchy in Libya.
Nuclear threats.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, a near-military confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union about the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. After an American naval quarantine blockade of Cuba, the Soviet Union under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. removing its missiles from Turkey. On October 16, 1964, China detonated its first atomic bomb. China possessed a hydrogen bomb by 1967.
Decolonization and independence.
The transformation of Africa from colonialism to independence in what is known as the decolonization of Africa dramatically accelerated during the decade, with 32 countries gaining independence between 1960 and 1968. Marking the end of the great European empires that once dominated the African continent. However, the noble aspirations of these new nations quickly faded, and many states descended into anarchy, kleptocracy, dictatorships, and/or civil war. The road to prosperity has been difficult. As of 2011, by many measures Africa continues to possess the poorest population in the world as well as the lowest life expectancy.
Prominent political events. United States.
1960, United States presidential election, 1960. The key turning point of the campaign was the series of 4 Kennedy-Nixon debates. They were the first presidential debates held on television. 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took office in 1961. Kennedy established the Peace Corps. 1963, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., on August 28, 1963, Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president and pressed for civil rights legislation. 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson was elected in his own right, defeating United States Senator Barry Goldwater in November. 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. This landmark piece of legislation in the United States outlawed racial segregation in schools, public places, and employment. 1964, Wilderness Act signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on September 3, 1965. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey took office in January. 1965, National Voting Rights Act of 1965 signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices that had been responsible for the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans in the United States. 1968, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon was elected, defeating Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey in November. 1969, U.S. President Richard Nixon was inaugurated in January 1969. Promised peace with honor to end the Vietnam War.
Canada.
The Quiet Revolution in Quebec altered the province-city-state into a more secular society. The Jean Lesage Liberal government created a welfare state État-providence and fomented the rise of active nationalism among francophone French-speaking Quebecois. On February 15, 1965, the new flag of Canada was adopted in Canada, After much anticipated debate known as the Great Canadian Flag Debate, in 1960, the Canadian Bill of Rights becomes law, and suffrage, and the right for any Canadian citizen to vote, was finally adopted by John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservative government. The new Election Act allowed First Nations people to vote for the first time.
Europe.
Construction of the Berlin Wall 1961. To prevent East Germans from escaping to the West, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered his Wind of Change speech in 1960. Pope John XXIII calls the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church, continued by Pope Paul VI, which met from October 11, 1962, until December 8, 1965. In October 1964, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was expelled from office due to his increasingly erratic and authoritarian behavior. Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin then became the new leaders of the Soviet Union. In Czechoslovakia, 1968 was the year of Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring, a source of inspiration to many Western leftists who admired Dubček's socialism with a human face. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August ended these hopes and also fatally damaged the chances of the Orthodox Communist parties drawing many recruits from the student protest movement.
China.
Relations with the United States remained hostile during the 1960s, although representatives from both countries held periodic meetings in Warsaw, Poland, since there was no U.S. embassy in China. President Kennedy had plans to restore Sino-U.S. relations, but his assassination, the war in Vietnam, and the Cultural Revolution put an end to that. Not until Richard Nixon took office in 1969 was there another opportunity. Following Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's expulsion in 1964, Sino-Soviet relations devolved into open hostility. The Chinese were deeply disturbed by the Soviet suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968, as the latter now claimed the right to intervene in any country it saw as deviating from the correct path of socialism. Finally, in March 1969, armed clashes took place along the Sino-Soviet border in Manchuria. This drove the Chinese to restore relations with the U.S., as Mao Zedong decided that the Soviet Union was a much greater threat.
Mexico.
The peak of the student and New Left protests in 1968 coincided with political upheavals in a number of other countries. Although these events often sprung from completely different causes, they were influenced by reports and images of what was happening in the United States and France.
Middle East.
On September 1, 1969, the Libyan monarchy was overthrown, and a radical, revolutionary, government headed by Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi took power.
South America.
In 1964, a successful coup against the democratically elected government of Brazilian President João Goulart initiated a military dictatorship that caused over 20 years of oppression. The Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara traveled to Africa and then Bolivia in his campaigning to spread worldwide revolution. He was captured and executed in 1967 by the Bolivian army, and afterwards became an iconic figure for leftists around the world. Juan Velasco Alvarado took power in Peru in 1968.
India.
In India, a literary and cultural movement started in Calcutta, Patna, and other cities by a group of writers and painters who called themselves Hungryalists, or members of the Hungry Generation. The band of writers wanted to change virtually everything and were arrested with several cases filed against them on various charges. They ultimately won these cases.
Assassinations.
The 1960s were marked by several notable assassinations. January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Republic of the Congo. Assassinated by a Belgian and Congolese firing squad outside Lubumbashi, Democratic Republic of the Congo. January 13, 1963, Sylvanus Olympio, the Prime Minister of Togo, is killed during the 1963 Togolese coup d'état. His body is dumped in front of the U.S. Embassy in Lome. May 27, 1963, Grigoris Lambrakis, Greek left-wing MP by far-right extremists with connections to the police and the army in Thessaloniki. June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers, an NAACP field secretary. Assassinated by a member of the Ku Klux Klan in Jackson, Mississippi, November 2, 1963, Ngo Dinh Diem, President of Vietnam, along with his brother and chief political advisor, Ngo Dinh Nhu. Assassinated by Duong Huynh Gia and Nguyen Van Nhung in the back of an armored personnel carrier, November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963 while in his open convertible car riding in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. According to the 1964 report issued by the Warren Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president, but there has been consistent speculation ever since that Kennedy's death was the result of a conspiracy. See JFK assassination for more details. February 21, 1965, Malcolm X assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in New York City. There is a dispute about which members killed Malcolm X. September 6, 1966, Hendrik Verwoerd, Prime Minister of South Africa and architect of apartheid, was stabbed to death by Dimitri Tsefenders, a parliamentary messenger. He survived a previous attempt on his life in 1960. August 25, 1967, George Lincoln Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi Party. Assassinated by John Pateler in Arlington, Virginia, April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King, Jr., civil rights leader. Assassinated by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee, June 5, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, United States Senator. Assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in Los Angeles, California, after taking California in the presidential national primaries.
Disasters.
Natural. The 1960 Valdivian earthquake, also known as the Great Chilean Earthquake, is to date the most powerful earthquake ever recorded, rating 9.5 on the moment magnitude scale. It caused localized tsunamis that severely battered the Chilean coast, with waves up to 25 meters, 82 feet. The main tsunami raced across the Pacific Ocean and devastated Hilo, Hawaii. 1963, Scorpio earthquake. The 1963 Scorpio earthquake was a 6.1 moment magnitude earthquake which occurred in Skopje, Xenia Macedonia, present-day Republic of Macedonia, on July 26, 1963, which killed over 1,070 people, injured between 3,000 and 4,000 and left more than 200,000 people homeless. About 80% of the city was destroyed. 1963, Vajont Dam disaster. The Vajont Dam flood in Italy was caused by a mountain sliding in the dam, and causing a flood wave that killed approximately 2,000 people in the towns in its path. 1964, the Good Friday earthquake, the most powerful earthquake recorded in the USA and North America, struck Alaska and killed 143 people. 1966, Hurricane Betsy caused severe damage to the U.S. Gulf Coast, especially in the state of Louisiana. 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught fire in Ohio. Fires had erupted on the river many times, including June 22, 1969, when a river fire captured the attention of Time magazine, which described the Cuyahoga as the river that oozes rather than flows, and in which a person does not drown but decays. This helped spur legislative action on water pollution control, resulting in the Clean Water Act, Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and the creation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. 1969, Hurricane Camille hit the U.S. Gulf Coast at Category 5 status. To date, it is the strongest hurricane ever recorded at landfall and means of sustained wind speed in the Atlantic Basin, reaching sustained winds of 190 miles per hour and a low pressure of 905 mbs. It is one of only 3 hurricanes in the Atlantic to ever make landfall at Category 5 status and one of only 4 hurricanes worldwide to reach a maximum sustained wind speed of 190 miles per hour. Non-natural. On December 16, 1960, a United Airlines DC-8 and a Trans World Airlines Lockheed Constellation collided over New York City and crashed, killing 134 people. On March 16, 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed Super Constellation, inexplicably disappeared over the western Pacific, leaving all 107 on board presumed dead. Since the wreckage of the aircraft has never been found, the cause of the crash remains a mystery to this day. On June 3, 1962, Air France Flight 007, a Boeing 707, crashed on takeoff from Paris. 130 people were killed in the crash while 2 survived. On May 20, 1965, PIA Flight 705 crashed on approach to Cairo, Egypt. 121 died while 6 survived. On February 4, 1966, All Nippon Airways Flight 60, a Boeing 727, plunged into Tokyo Bay for reasons unknown. All 133 people on board perished. On March 5, 1966, BOAC Flight 911 broke up in midair and crashed on the slopes of Mount Fuji. All 124 aboard died. On March 16, 1969, a DC-9 operating Viasa Flight 742 crashed in the Venezuelan city of Maracaibo. A total of 155 people died in the crash.
Social and political movements. Counterculture social revolution.
In the second half of the decade, young people began to revolt against the conservative norms of the time, as well as remove themselves from mainstream liberalism, in particular the high level of materialism which was so common during the era. This created a counterculture that sparked a social revolution throughout much of the Western world. It began in the United States as a reaction against the conservatism and social conformity of the 1950s, and the U.S. government's extensive military intervention in Vietnam. The youth involved in the popular social aspects of the movement became known as hippies. These groups created a movement toward liberation in society, including the sexual revolution, questioning authority in government, and demanding more freedoms and rights for women and minorities. The underground press, a widespread, eclectic collection of newspapers, served as a unifying medium for the counterculture. The movement was also marked by the first widespread, socially accepted drug use, including LSD and marijuana, and psychedelic music.
Anti-war movement.
The war in Vietnam would eventually lead to a commitment of over 500,000 American troops, resulting in over 58,500 American deaths and producing a large-scale anti-war movement in the United States. As late as the end of 1965, few Americans protested the American involvement in Vietnam, but as the war dragged on and the body count continued to climb, civil unrest escalated. Students became a powerful and disruptive force, and university campuses sparked a national debate over the war. As the movement's ideals spread beyond college campuses, doubts about the war also began to appear within the administration itself. A mass movement began rising in opposition to the Vietnam War, ending in the massive moratorium protests in 1969, as well as the movement of resistance to conscription, the draft for the war. The anti-war movement was initially based on the older 1950s peace movement, heavily influenced by the American Communist Party, but by the mid-1960s it outgrew this and became a broad-based mass movement centered in universities and churches. One kind of protest was called a sit-in. Other terms heard in the United States included the draft, draft dodger, conscientious objector, and Vietnam vet. Voter age limits were challenged by the phrase, "If you're old enough to die for your country, you're old enough to vote."
African American Civil Rights Movement 1955 to 1968.
See African American Civil Rights Movement. Beginning in the mid-1950s and continuing into the late 1960s, African Americans in the United States aimed at outlawing racial discrimination against Black Americans and restoring voting rights to them. This article covers the phase of the movement between 1955 and 1968, particularly in the South. The emergence of the Black Power movement, which lasted roughly from 1966 to 1975, enlarged the aims of the civil rights movement to include racial dignity, economic and political self-sufficiency, and freedom from oppression by white Americans. The movement was characterized by major campaigns of civil resistance. Between 1955 and 1968, acts of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience produced crisis situations between activists and government authorities. Federal, state, and local governments, businesses, and communities often had to respond immediately to these situations that highlighted the inequities faced by African Americans. Forms of protest and/or civil disobedience included boycotts such as the successful Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, in Alabama. Sit-ins such as the influential Greensboro sit-ins, 1960, in North Carolina. Marches, such as the Selma to Montgomery marches, 1965, in Alabama. And a wide range of other nonviolent activities. Noted legislative achievements during this phase of the civil rights movement were passage of Civil Rights Act of 1964, that banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in employment practices and public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, that restored and protected voting rights. The Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965, that dramatically opened entry to the U.S. to immigrants other than traditional European groups. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968, that banned discrimination in the sale or rental of housing.
Hispanic and Chicano movement.
Another large ethnic minority group, the Mexican Americans, are among other Hispanics in the U.S. who fought to end racial discrimination and socio-economic disparity. The largest Mexican American populations was in the southwestern United States, such as California with over 1 million Chicanos in Los Angeles alone, and Texas where Jim Crow laws included Mexican Americans as non-white in some instances to be legally segregated. Socially, the Chicano movement addressed what it perceived to be negative ethnic stereotypes of Mexicans in mass media and the American consciousness. It did so through the creation of works of literary and visual art that validated Mexican American ethnicity and culture. Chicanos fought to end social stigmas such as the usage of the Spanish language and advocated official bilingualism in federal and state governments. The Chicano movement also addressed discrimination in public and private institutions. Early in the 20th century, Mexican Americans formed organizations to protect themselves from discrimination. One of those organizations, the League of United Latin American Citizens, was formed in 1929 and remains active today. The movement gained momentum after World War II when groups such as the American GI Forum, which was formed by returning Mexican American veterans, joined in the efforts by other civil rights organizations. Mexican American civil rights activists achieved several major legal victories including the 1947 Mendez v. Westminster U.S. Supreme Court ruling which declared that segregating children of Mexican and Latin descent was unconstitutional and the 1954 Hernandez v. Texas ruling which declared that Mexican Americans and other racial groups in the United States were entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The most prominent civil rights organization in the Mexican American community, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, was founded in 1968. Although modeled after the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF has also taken on many of the functions of other organizations, including political advocacy and training of local leaders. Meanwhile, Puerto Ricans in the U.S. mainland fought against racism, police brutality and socio-economic problems affecting the 3 million Puerto Ricans residing in 50 states. The main concentration was in New York City. In the 1960s and the following 1970s, Hispanic American culture was on the rebound like ethnic music, foods, culture and identity both became popular and assimilated into the American mainstream. Spanish-language television networks, radio stations and newspapers increased in presence across the country, especially in U.S. Mexican border towns and East Coast cities like New York City, and the growth of the Cuban American community in Miami, Florida. The multitude of discrimination at this time represented an inhuman side to a society that in the 1960s was upheld as a world and industry leader. The issues of civil rights and warfare became major points of reflection of virtue and democracy, What once was viewed as traditional and inconsequential was now becoming the significance and the turning point of a culture. A document known as the Port Huron Statement exemplifies these two conditions perfectly in its first-hand depiction. While these and other problems either directly oppressed us or rankled our consciences and became our own subjective concerns, we began to see complicated and disturbing paradoxes in our surrounding America. The declaration all men are created equal rang hollow before the facts of Negro life in the South and the big cities of the North. The proclaimed peaceful intentions of the United States contradicted its economic and military investments in the Cold War status quo. These intolerable issues became too visible to ignore, therefore its repercussions were feared greatly. The realization that we as individuals take the responsibility for encounter and resolution in our lives issues was an emerging idealism of the 1960s.
Second wave feminism.
A second wave of feminism in the United States and around the world gained momentum in the early 1960s. While the first wave of the early 20th century was centered on gaining suffrage and overturning de jure inequalities, the second wave was focused on changing cultural and social norms and de facto inequalities associated with women. At the time, a woman's place was generally seen as being in the home, and they were excluded from many jobs and professions. Commercials often portrayed a woman as being helpless if her car broke down. In the U.S., a presidential commission on the status of women found discrimination against women in the workplace and every other aspect of life, a revelation which launched 2 decades of prominent women-centered legal reforms, that is, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title IX, etc., which broke down the last remaining legal barriers to women's personal freedom and professional success. Feminists took to the streets, marching and protesting, writing books and debating to change social and political views that limited women. In 1963, with Betty Friedan's revolutionary book, The Feminine Mystique, the role of women in society, and in public and private life was questioned. By 1966, the movement was beginning to grow in size and power as women's groups spread across the country, and Friedan, along with other feminists, founded the National Organization for Women. In 1968, women's liberation became a household term as, for the first time, the new women's movement eclipsed the Black civil rights movement when New York radical women, led by Robin Morgan, protested the annual Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The movement continued throughout the next decades. Gloria Steinem was a key feminist.
Gay rights movement.
The United States, in the middle of a social revolution, led the world in LGBT rights in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Inspired by the civil rights movement and the women's movement, early gay rights pioneers had begun, by the 1960s, to build a movement. These groups were rather conservative in their practices, emphasizing that gay men and women are no different from those who are straight and deserve full equality. This philosophy would be dominant again after AIDS, but by the very end of the 1960s, the movement's goals would change and become more radical, demanding a right to be different, and encouraging gay pride. The symbolic birth of the gay rights movement would not come until the decade had almost come to a close. Gays were not allowed by law to congregate. Gay establishments such as the Stonewall Inn in New York City were routinely raided by the police to arrest gay people. On a night in late June 1969, LGBT people resisted, for the first time, a police raid, and rebelled openly in the streets. This uprising, called the Stonewall Riots, began a new period of the LGBT rights movement that in the next decade would cause dramatic change both inside the LGBT community and in the mainstream American culture.
New Left.
The rapid rise of a new left applied the class perspective of Marxism to post-war America, but had little organizational connection with older Marxist organizations such as the Communist Party, and even went as far as to reject organized labor as the basis of a unified left-wing movement. The new left differed from the traditional left in its resistance to dogma and its emphasis on personal as well as societal change. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, became the organizational focus of the new left and was the prime mover behind the opposition to the war in Vietnam. The 1960s left also consisted of ephemeral campus-based Trotskyist, Maoist and anarchist groups, some of which by the end of the 1960s had turned to militancy.
Crime.
The 1960s was also associated with a large increase in crime and urban unrest of all types. Between 1960 and 1969 reported incidences of violent crime per 100,000 people in the United States nearly doubled and have yet to return to the levels of the early 1960s. Large riots broke out in many cities like Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York City, Newark, New Jersey, Oakland, California and Washington, D.C. By the end of the decade, politicians like George Wallace and Richard Nixon campaigned on restoring law and order to a nation troubled with the new unrest.
Science and technology. Science. Space exploration.
The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union dominated the 1960s. The Soviets sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into outer space during the Vostok 1 mission on April 12, 1961 and scored a host of other successes, but by the middle of the decade the U.S. was taking the lead. In May 1961, President Kennedy set for the U.S. the goal of a manned spacecraft landing on the Moon by the end of the decade. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Luna 10, which later became the first space probe to enter orbit around the Moon. The deaths of astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward Higgins White, and Roger B. Chaffee in the Apollo 1 fire on January 27, 1967, put a temporary hold on the U.S. space program, but afterward progress was steady, with the Apollo 8 crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, William Anders, being the first manned mission to orbit another celestial body, the Moon, during Christmas of 1968. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11, the first human spaceflight landed on the Moon. Launched on July 16, 1969, it carried mission commander Neil Armstrong, command module pilot Michael Collins, and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin. Apollo 11 fulfilled President John F. Kennedy's goal of reaching the Moon by the end of the 1960s, which he had expressed during a speech given before a joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The Soviet program lost its sense of direction with the death of chief designer Sergei Kirillaev in 1966. Political pressure, conflicts between different design bureaus, and engineering problems caused by an inadequate budget would doom the Soviet attempt to land men on the Moon. A succession of unmanned American and Soviet probes traveled to the Moon, Venus, and Mars during the 1960s, and commercial satellites also came into use.
Other scientific developments.
1960, the female birth control contraceptive, the pill, was released in the United States after Food and Drug Administration, FDA, approval. 1965, AstroTurf introduced. 1967, first heart transplantation operation by Professor Christiaan Barnard in South Africa.
Technology. Automobiles.
As the 1960s began, American cars showed a rapid rejection of 1950s styling excess, and would remain relatively clean and boxy for the entire decade. The horsepower race reached its climax in the late 1960s. With muscle cars sold by most makes. The compact Ford Mustang, launched in 1964, was one of the decade's greatest successes. The big three American automakers enjoyed their highest ever sales and profitability in the 1960s, but the demise of Studebaker in 1966 left American Motors Corporation as the last significant independent. The decade would see the car market split into different size classes for the first time, and model lineups now included compact and mid-sized cars in addition to full-sized ones. The popular modern hatchback, with front-wheel drive and a two-box configuration, was born in 1965 with the introduction of the Renault 16. Many of this car's design principles live on in its modern counterparts, a large rear opening incorporating the rear window, foldable rear seats to extend boot space. The Mini, released in 1959, had first popularized the front-wheel drive two-box configuration, but technically was not a hatchback as it had a fold-down boot lid. Japanese cars also began to gain acceptance in the Western market, and popular economy models such as the Toyota Corolla, Datsun 510, and the first popular Japanese sports car, the Datsun 240Z, were released in the mid to late 1960s.
Electronics and communications.
1960, the first working laser was demonstrated in May by Theodore Maiman at Hughes Research Laboratories. 1961, Animate, the first industrial robot, was introduced. 1962, first transatlantic satellite broadcast via the Telstar satellite. 1962, the first computer video game, Space War, was invented. 1962, red LEDs were developed. 1963, the first geosynchronous communications satellite, SYNCOM-2 is launched. 1963, first trans-Pacific satellite broadcast via the Relay One satellite. 1963, touch-tone telephones introduced. 1963, Sketchpad was the first touch interactive computer graphics program. 1963, video recorder. The Nottingham Electronic Valve Company produced the first home video recorder called the Telcon. 1964, 8-track tape audio format was developed. 1964, the compact cassette was introduced. 1964, the first successful mini-computer, Digital Equipment Corporation's 12-bit PDP-8, was marketed. 1964, the programming language BASIC was created. 1964, the world's first supercomputer, the CDC 6600, was introduced. 1964, Fairchild Semiconductor released ICs with dual inline packaging. 1967, PAL and SECAM broadcast color television systems started publicly transmitting in Europe. 1967, the first automatic teller machine was opened in Barclays Bank, London. 1968, Ralph Baer developed his Brown Box, a working prototype of the Magnavox Odyssey. 1968, the first public demonstration of the computer mouse, the paper paradigm graphical user interface, video conferencing, teleconferencing, email, and hypertext. 1969, ARPANET, the research-oriented prototype of the Internet, was introduced. 1969, CCD invented at AT&T Bell Labs, used as the electronic imager in still and video cameras.
Popular culture.
The counterculture movement dominated the second half of the 1960s, its most famous moments being the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967, and the Woodstock Festival in upstate New York in 1969. Psychedelic drugs, especially LSD, were widely used medicinally, spiritually and recreationally throughout the late 1960s, and were popularized by Timothy Leary with his slogan "Turn on, tune in, drop out." Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters also played a part in the role of turning heads on. Psychedelic influenced the music, artwork and films of the decade, and a number of prominent musicians died of drug overdoses, see 27 Club. There was a growing interest in Eastern religions and philosophy, and many attempts were made to found communes, which varied from supporting free love to religious puritanism.
Music.
Popular music entered an era of all hits, as numerous artists released recordings, beginning in the 1950s, as 45 RPM singles, with another on the flip side, and radio stations tended to play only the most popular of the wide variety of records being made. Also, bands tended to record only the best of their songs as a chance to become a hit record. The taste of the American listeners expanded from the folk singer, doo-wop and saxophone sounds of the 1950s to the Motown sound, folk rock and the British invasion led by the Beatles in 1964. The Los Angeles and San Francisco sound began in this period with many popular bands coming out of LA and the Haight-Ashbury district, well known for its hippie culture. The rise of the counterculture movement, particularly among the youth, created a market for rock, soul, pop, reggae and blues music. Significant events in music in the 1960s. Elvis Presley returned to civilian life in the U.S. after 2 years away in the U.S. Army. He resumes his musical career by recording It's Now or Never, and Are You Lonesome Tonight? In March 1960, Motown Record Corporation was founded in 1960. Its first top 10 hit was Shop Around by the Miracles in 1960. Shop Around peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, and was Motown's first million-selling record. Folk singer and activist Joan Baez released her debut album on Vanguard Records in December 1960. The Marvelettes scored Motown Record Corporation's first U.S. #1 pop hit, Please Mr. Postman, in 1961. Motown would score 110 Billboard Top 10 hits during its run. The Four Seasons released 3 straight #1 hits. In a widely anticipated and publicized event, the Beatles arrive in America in February 1964, spearheading the British invasion. The Mary Poppins original soundtrack tops record charts. Sherman Brothers receive Grammys and double Oscars. Leslie Gore, at age 17, hits #1 on Billboard with It's My Party, and 64 with #2 You Don't Own Me. Behind the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand. The Supremes scored 12 #1 hit singles between 1964 and 1969, beginning with Where Did Our Love Go? The Kinks release You Really Got Me in late 1964, which tops the British charts. It is regarded as the first hard rock hit and a blueprint for related genres, such as heavy metal. John Coltrane released A Love Supreme in late 1964, considered among the most acclaimed jazz albums of the era. The Grateful Dead was formed in 1965, originally the Warlocks, thus paving the way, giving birth to acid rock. Bob Dylan went electric at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. Cilla Black's #1 hit Anyone Who Had a Heart still remains the top-selling single by a female artist in the UK from 1964. The Rolling Stones had a huge #1 hit with their song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction in the summer of 1965. The Byrds released a cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, which reached #1 on the US charts and repeated the feat in the UK. Shortly thereafter, the extremely influential track effectively creates the musical subgenre of folk rock. Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone is a top 5 hit on both sides of the Atlantic during the summer of 1965. Bob Dylan's 1965 albums Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited ushered in album-focused rock and the folk rock genre. Simon and Garfunkel released the Sound of Silence single in 1965. The Beach Boys released Pet Sounds in 1966, which significantly influenced the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album released the following year. Bob Dylan was called Judas by an audience member during the Manchester Free Trade Hall concert. The start of the bootleg recording industry follows, with recordings of this concert circulating for 30 years, wrongly labeled as the Royal Albert Hall Concert before a legitimate release in 1998 as the Bootleg Series Volume 4, Bob Dylan Live 1966, the Royal Albert Hall Concert. In February 1966, Nancy Sinatra's song These Boots Are Made for Walking became very popular. In 1966, The Supremes' A Go-Go was the first album by a female group to reach the top position of the Billboard magazine Pop Albums chart in the United States. The Seekers were the first Australian group to have a #1 with Georgie Girl in 1966. Jefferson Airplane released the influential Surrealistic Pillow in 1967. The Velvet Underground released its self-titled debut album The Velvet Underground on Nico in 1967. The Doors released its self-titled debut album The Doors in January 1967. Love released Forever Changes in 1967. The Procol Harum released A White a Shade of Pale in 1967. Cream Band released Disraeli Gears in 1967. The Jimi Hendrix Experience released 2 successful albums during 1967, Are You Experienced and Axis, Bold as Love, that innovate both guitar, trio and recording techniques. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in June 1967. The Moody Blues released the album Days of Future Past in November 1967. R&B legend Otis Redding has his first #1 hit with the legendary Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. He also played at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 just before he died in a plane crash. Pink Floyd released its debut record The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Bob Dylan released the country rock album John Wesley Harding in December 1967. The Bee Gees released their international debut album Bee Gees First in July 1967, which included the pop standard To Love Somebody. The Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 was the beginning of the so-called Summer of Love. Johnny Cash released at Folsom Prison in 1968. 1968, after the Yardbirds fold, Led Zeppelin was formed by Jimmy Page and manager Peter Grant, with Robert Plant, John Bonham and John Paul Jones. And released their debut album Led Zeppelin. The band released the roots rock album Music from Big Pink in 1968. Big Brother and the Holding Company, with Janis Joplin as lead singer, became an overnight sensation after their performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 and released their second album Cheap Thrills in 1968. Gram Parsons with the Byrds released the extremely influential LP Sweetheart of the Rodeo in late 1968. Forming the basis for country rock, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released the highly influential double LP Electric Ladyland in 1968 that furthered the guitar and studio innovations of his previous two albums. Simon and Garfunkel released the single Mrs. Robinson in 1968. Featured in the film The Graduate, Sly and the Family Stone revolutionized black music with their massive 1968 hit single Dance to the Music, and by 1969 became international sensations with the release of their hit record Stand. The band cemented their position as a vital counterculture band when they performed at the Woodstock Festival. The Gun released Race with the Devil in October 1968. The Rolling Stones filmed the TV special The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus in December 1968, but the film was not released for transmission. Considered for decades as a fabled lost performance until released in North America on Laserdisc and VHS in 1996. Features performances from The Who. The Dirty Mac featuring John Lennon, Eric Clapton and Mitch Mitchell. Jethro Tull and Taj Mahal, the Woodstock Festival, and 4 months later, the Altamont Free Concert in 1969. The Who released and toured the first rock opera Tommy in 1969. Proto-punk band MC5 released the live album Kick Out the Jams in 1969. Captain Beefheart and his Magic Brand released the avant-garde Trout Mask replica in 1969. The Stooges released their debut album in 1969. The Flying Burrito Brothers released their influential debut The Gilded Palace of Sin in 1969. King Crimson released their debut album In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969.
Film.
The highest-grossing film of the decade was 20th Century Fox's The Sound of Music, 1965. Some of Hollywood's most notable blockbuster films of the 1960s include 2001, A Space Odyssey, The Birds, Bonnie and Clyde, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Carnival of Souls, Cool Hand Luke, The Dirty Dozen, Dr. Zhivago, Dr. Strangelove, Easy Rider, Faces, The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Head, The Hustler, Ice Station Zebra, In the Heat of the Night, The Jungle Book, Lawrence of Arabia, The Lion in Winter, Mary Poppins, Medium Cool, Midnight Cowboy, Night of the Living Dead, The Pink Panther, Planet of the Apes, Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, The Sound of Music, Spartacus, The Wild Bunch. The counterculture movement had a significant effect on cinema. Movies began to break social taboos such as sex and violence, causing both controversy and fascination. They turned increasingly dramatic, unbalanced, and hectic as the Cultural Revolution was starting. This was the beginning of the new Hollywood era that dominated the next decade in theaters and revolutionized the film industry. Films of this time also focused on the changes happening in the world. Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, 1969, focused on the drug culture of the time. Movies also became more sexually explicit, such as Roger Vaadim's Barbarella, 1968, as the counterculture progressed. In Europe, art cinema gains wider distribution and sees movements like La Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave, featuring French filmmakers such as Roger Vadim, François Truffaut, Alain Resnais, and Jean-Luc Godard. Cinema Verite documentary movement in Canada, France and the United States. Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman, Chilean filmmaker Alexandro Jodorowsky and Polish filmmakers Roman Polanski and Wojciech Jerzy has produced original and offbeat masterpieces and the high point of Italian filmmaking, with Michelangelo Antonioni and Federico Fellini making some of their most known films during this period. Notable films from this period include La Dolce Vita, 81/2, La Notte, L'Eclisse, The Red Desert, Blow Up, Satyricon, Acatone, The Gospel According to St. Matthew, Theorem, Winter Light, The Silence, Persona, Shame, A Passion, Orsat Balthazar, Moachet, Last Year at Marienbad, Chronic Dunit, Titicut Follies, High School, Salesman, La Jetée, Warrendale, Knife in the Water, Repulsion, The Saragossa Manuscript, El Topo, A Hard Day's Night, and the Cinema Verite Don't Look Back. In Japan, a film version of the story of the 47 Ronin entitled Chushingara, Hana no Maki, Yuki no Maki, directed by Hiroshi Inagaki, was released in 1962. The legendary story was also remade as a television series in Japan. Academy Award-winning Japanese director Akira Kurosawa produced Yojimbo, 1961, and Sanjuro, 1962, which both starred Toshiro Mifune as a mysterious samurai swordsman for hire. Like his previous films, both had a profound influence around the world. The spaghetti western genre was a direct outgrowth of the Kurosawa films. The influence of these films is most apparent in Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, starring Clint Eastwood, and Walter Hill's Last Man Standing, 1996. Yojimbo was also the origin of the Man with No Name trend, which included Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, both also starring Clint Eastwood, and arguably continued through his 1968 opus Once Upon a Time in the West, starring Henry Fonda, Charles Bronson, Claudia Cardinale, and Jason Robards. The Magnificent Seven, a 1960 American Western film directed by John Sturges, was a remake of Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film, Seven Samurai. The 1960s were also about experimentation. With the explosion of lightweight and affordable cameras, the underground avant-garde film movement thrived. Canada's Michael Snow, Americans Kenneth Anger, Stan Brakhage, Andy Warhol, and Jack Smith. Notable films in this genre are Dog Star Man, Scorpio Rising, Wavelength, Chelsea Girls, Blow Job, Vinyl, Flaming Creatures. Significant events in the film industry in the 1960s. Removal of the Motion Picture Association of America's production code in 1967, the decline and end of the studio system, the rise of art house films and theaters, the end of the classical Hollywood cinema era, the beginning of the new Hollywood era due to the counterculture, the rise of independent producers that worked outside of the studio system, moved to all-color production in Hollywood films, the invention of the Negra one-quarter, sync sound, portable open-reel tape deck, Expo 67, where new film formats like IMAX were invented and new ways of displaying film were tested, flatbed film editing tables appear, like the Steinbeck. They eventually replaced the Moviola editing platform, the French New Wave, direct cinema and cinema verite documentaries, the transition of traditional animation to limited animation.
Television.
The most prominent American TV series of the 1960s include The Ed Sullivan Show, Peyton Place, Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, The Andy Williams Show, The Dean Martin Show, The Wonderful World of Disney, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Beverly Hillbillies, Bonanza, Batman, McHale's Navy, Laugh-In, The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Fugitive, The Tonight Show, Gunsmoke, The Andy Griffith Show, Gilligan's Island, Mission Impossible, The Flintstones, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Lassie, The Danny Thomas Show, The Lucy Show, My Three Sons, The Red Skelton Show, Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie. The Flintstones was a favored show, receiving 40 million views an episode with an average of 3 views a day. Some programming such as the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour became controversial by challenging the foundations of America's corporate and governmental controls, making fun of world leaders, and questioning U.S. involvement in and escalation of the Vietnam War. Walt Disney, owner of Walt Disney Company, died on December 15, 1966, from a major tumor in his left lung.
Fashion.
Significant fashion trends of the 1960s include: the Beatles exerted an enormous influence on young men's fashions and hairstyles in the 1960s, which included most notably the mop-top haircut, the Beatle boots and the Nehru jacket. The hippie movement late in the decade also had a strong influence on clothing styles, including bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye and batik fabrics, as well as paisley prints. The bikini came into fashion in 1963 after being featured in the film Beach Party. Mary Quant invented the mini-skirt, which became the rage in the late 1960s. Men's mainstreamed hairstyles ranged from the pompadour, the crew cut, the flat-top hairstyle, the tapered hairstyle, and short, parted hair in the early part of the decade, to longer parted hairstyles with sideburns towards the latter half of the decade. Women's mainstreamed hairstyles ranged from beehive hairdos, the bird's nest hairstyle, and the chignon hairstyle in the early part of the decade, to very short styles popularized by Twiggy and Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby towards the latter half of the decade. African American hairstyles for men and women included the afro.
Sports. Olympics.
There were 6 Olympic Games held during the decade. These were: 1960 Summer Olympics, August 25 to September 11, 1960, in Rome, Italy. 1960 Winter Olympics, 18 to February 28, 1960, in Squaw Valley Ski Resort, California, United States. 1964 Summer Olympics, 10 to October 24, 1964, in Tokyo, Japan. 1964 Winter Olympics, January 29 to February 9, 1964, in Innsbruck, Austria. 1968 Summer Olympics, 12 to October 27, 1968, in Mexico City, Mexico. 1968 Winter Olympics, 6 to February 18, 1968, in Grenoble, France.
Association football.
There were 2 FIFA World Cups during the decade. 1962 FIFA World Cup, hosted in Chile, won by Brazil. 1966 FIFA World Cup, hosted and won by England.
Baseball.
Major League Baseball expansion in 1961 included the formation of the Los Angeles Angels, the move to Minnesota to become the Minnesota Twins by the former Washington Senators, and the formation of a new franchise called the Washington Senators. Major League Baseball sanctioned both the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Mets as new National League franchises in 1962. In 1969, the American League expanded when the Kansas City Royals and Seattle Pilots were admitted to the league, prompting the expansion of the postseason for the first time since the creation of the World Series. The Pilots stayed just 1 season in Seattle before moving and becoming the Milwaukee Brewers in 1970. The National League also added 2 teams in 1969, the Montreal Expos and San Diego Padres. By 1969, at the end of the 1960s, the New York Mets won the World Series in only the 8th year of the team's existence.
Disc sports frisbee.
Alternative sports, using the flying disc, began in the mid-60s. As numbers of young people became alienated from social norms, they resisted and looked for alternatives. They would form what would become known as the counterculture. The forms of escape and resistance would manifest in many ways, including social activism, alternative lifestyles, experimental living through foods, dress, music and alternative recreational activities, including that of throwing a frisbee. Starting with promotional efforts from Wham-O and Irwin Toy, Canada, a few tournaments and professionals using frisbee show tours to perform at universities, fairs and sporting events. Disc sports such as freestyle, double disc court, guts, disc ultimate and disc golf became this sport's first events. 2 sports, The team sport of disc ultimate and disc golf are very popular worldwide and are now being played semi-professionally. The World Flying Disc Federation, Professional Disc Golf Association and the Freestyle Players Association are the official rules and sanctioning organizations for flying disc sports worldwide. Major League Ultimate, MLU, and the American Ultimate Disc League, AUDL, are the first semi-professional ultimate leagues.
Racing.
In motorsports, the Can-Am and Trans Am series were both established in 1966. The Ford GT40 won outright in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Graham Hill edged out Jackie Stewart and Denny Hulme for the World Championship in Formula One.
People. World leaders.
Alphabetically by country. Prime Minister Robert Menzies, Australia. Prime Minister Harold Holt, Australia. Prime Minister John McEwen, Australia. Prime Minister John Gorton, Australia. President João Goulart, Brazil. President Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco, Brazil. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, Canada. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, Canada. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Canada. Chairman Mao Zedong, People's Republic of China. President Liu Shaoqi, People's Republic of China. Premier Zhou Enlai, People's Republic of China. President Chiang Kai-shek, Republic of China on Taiwan. President Alberto Lares Camargo, Colombia. President Guillermo Leon Valencia, Colombia. President Carlos Lares Restrepo, Colombia. Prime Minister Fidel Castro, Cuba. President Antonin Novotny, Czechoslovakia. President Ludvík Svoboda, Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Viggo Kampmann, Denmark. Prime Minister Jens Otto Krag, Denmark. Prime Minister Hilma Bonsgaard, Denmark. President Camilo Ponce Enriquez, Ecuador, until 1960. President Carlos Julio Arocena Monroy, Ecuador. President Clemente Yerovi, Ecuador. President Otto Arocena, Ecuador. President José María Velasco Ibarra, Ecuador. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt. Emperor Haile Selassie I, Ethiopia. President Urho Kekkonen, Finland. President Charles de Gaulle, France. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, India. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, India. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran. President Mohammad Najib Rubai, Iraq. President Abdul Salam Arif, Iraq. President Abd Rahman al-Bazzaz, Iraq, acting. President Abdul Rahman Arif, Iraq. President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Iraq. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, Israel. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, Israel. Emperor Hirohito, Japan. Pope John XXIII, Pope Paul VI. President Vahd Shahab, Lebanon. King Idris of the Kingdom of Libya. President Muammar Gaddafi of the Libyan Arab Republic, from 1969. Prime Minister Walter Nash, New Zealand. Prime Minister Keith Holyoake, New Zealand. Prime Minister Basil Brooke, Northern Ireland. Prime Minister Terence O'Neill, Northern Ireland. Prime Minister James Chichester Clark, Northern Ireland. President Ayub Khan, Pakistan. Governor Louis A. Fur, Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. President Fernando Belaunterre, Peru. President Juan Valesco Alvarado, Peru. Taoiseach Sean Lemass, Republic of Ireland. Taoiseach Jack Lynch, Republic of Ireland. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev, Soviet Union. Prime Minister Suleiman Demirel, Turkey. Queen Elizabeth II, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, United Kingdom. Prime Minister Harold Wilson, United Kingdom. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, United States, until 1961. President John F. Kennedy, United States. President Lyndon Johnson, United States. President Richard Nixon, United States. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, West Germany. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, West Germany. Chancellor Kurt Georg Kissinger, West Germany. President for life Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia.
Political figures.
Ibrahim Helmi Abdelrahman, Executive Director United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Konrad Adenauer, Chevalier Georges Annes de Taboada, Secretary-General World Customs Organization, Santiago Astrain Castro, Secretary-General International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, Ella Baker, Mamoun Baheri, President African Development Bank, Walter Binafi, President of the Council International Civil Aviation Organization, André Dublinay, Secretary-General Interparliamentary Union, Leonid Brezhnev, Avery Brundage, President International Olympic Committee, Marcelino Gomez Candor, Director General World Health Organization, Stokely Carmichael, Fidel Castro, Cesar Chavez, Winston Churchill, Park Chung-hee, Ramsey Clark, David Arthur Davis, Secretary-General World Meteorological Organization, Moshe Dayan, Abba Eban, Nikolai Vasilyevich Fedorov, Secretary Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Nikolai Pavlovich Fyubin, Secretary-General of the Political Consultative Committee Warsaw Treaty Organization, Paride Formentini, President of the European Investment Bank, Manuel Fraga Iribarne, Secretary-General Latin Union, Charles de Gaulle, Barry Goldwater, André Gromyko, Che Guevara, Denis Gizmes, Chiang Kai-shek, David Ben-Gurion, Avril Harriman, Abdel Khalik Hassouna, Secretary-General Arab League, Tom Hayden, Luis Felipe Herrera Lane, President Inter-American Development Bank, Abby Hoffman, Paul G. Hoffman, Administrator United Nations Development Programme, J. Edgar Hoover, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Edward M. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Nikita S. Khrushchev, John Lindsay, Robert C. Lunati, Secretary-General World Tourism Organization, Ferdinand Marcos, Harold Macmillan, Eugene McCarthy, Robert McNamara, Golda Meir, Robert Menzies, Ho Chi Minh, Robin Morgan, David A. Morse, Director General International Labour Organization, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Huey P. Newton, Richard M. Nixon, Lester B. Pearson, Ronald Reagan, Jackie Robinson, Nelson A. Rockefeller, George W. Romney, Eleanor Roosevelt, Dean Rusk, Isaku Sato, Mario Savio, Bobby Seale, Arnold Smith, Secretary-General the Commonwealth, Margaret Chase Smith, Sun Ching Ling, Gloria Steinem, Adlai Stevenson II, Suharto, U Thant, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, George Wallace, Earl Warren, Takeshi Watanabe, President Asian Development Bank, Eric Wyndham White, Executive Secretary World Trade Organization, Harold Wilson, Malcolm X, Mao Zedong.
Activists.
Some activist leaders of the 1960s period include Mario Savio, John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Martin Luther King, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Dick Gregory, Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin.
Musicians.
Paul Anka, Louis Armstrong, Joan Baez, Syd Barrett, The Beatles, Harry Belafonte, Chuck Berry, Johnny Cash, Mama Cass, Eric Clapton, Leonard Cohen, Judy Collins, John Coltrane, Sam Cooke, David Crosby, Roger Daltrey, Bobby Darin, Miles Davis, Donovan, Judith Durham, Bob Dylan, John Entwistle, Ella Fitzgerald, John Fogerty, Jerry Garcia, Leslie Gore, George Harrison, Jimi Hendrix, Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, Janis Joplin, Freddie King, Chris Christopherson, John Lennon, Phil Lesh, Ray Manzarek, Bob Marley, Dean Martin, Paul McCartney, Freddie Mercury, Joni Mitchell, Keith Moon, Jim Morrison, Van Morrison, Ricky Nelson, Bob Newirth, Odetta, Jimmy Page, Pink Floyd, Robert Plant, Art Pepper, Elvis Presley, Billy Preston, The Rascals, Lou Reed, Cliff Richard, Keith Richards, Diana Ross, Jimmy Rogers, Neil Sedaka, The Shadows, Pete Seeger, Paul Simon, Frank Sinatra, Grace Slick, Dusty Springfield, Ringo Starr, Stephen Stills, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Sly Stone, Pete Townshend, Bob Weir, Andy Williams, Brian Wilson, Neil Young, Frank Zappa, Joey Gilberto, Astrud Gilberto, Sonny and Cher.
Entertainers.
Woody Allen, Ed Ames, Julie Andrews, Lucille Ball, Jerry Mathers, John Provost, Brigitte Bardot, Warren Beatty, Marlon Brando, Lenny Bruce, Yul Brynner, Richard Burton, Tony Curtis, Doris Day, Sandra Dee, Alain Delon, Kirk Douglas, Clint Eastwood, Jane Fonda, Peter Fonda, Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn, Katharine Hepburn, Charlton Heston, Dustin Hoffman, Dennis Hopper, Rock Hudson, Grace Kelly, Burt Lancaster, Bruce Lee, Janet Leigh, Jerry Lewis, Jack Lemmon, Sophia Loren, Marcello Mastroianni, Shirley MacLaine, Robert Mitchum, Cliff Robertson, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Montgomery, Jeanne Moreau, Paul Newman, Kim Novak, Laurence Olivier, Peter O'Toole, Al Pacino, Gregory Peck, Anthony Perkins, Anthony Quinn, Cesar Romero, Mort Zal, Omar Sharif, Edie Sedgwick, Peter Sellers, Jean Shepherd, James Stewart, Barbra Streisand, Sharon Tate, Elizabeth Taylor, Dick Van Dyke, John Wayne, Adam West, Shelley Winters, Natalie Wood.
Filmmakers:
Kenneth Anger, Michelangelo Antonioni, Ingmar Bergman, Stan Brakhage, Claude Chabrol, Montgomery Clift, Federico Fellini, Jean-Luc Godard, Alfred Hitchcock, Alan King, Stanley Kubrick, Akira Kurosawa, Richard Leacock, Sergio Leone, Louis Malle, Albert and David Maysles, Pier Paolo Pasolini, D. A. Pennebaker, Roman Polanski, Alain Resnais, Jacques Rivette, Eric Romer, George A. Romero, Jean Rauch, Francois Truffaut, Orson Welles, Frederick Wiseman, Tippi Hedren.
Intellectuals:
Richard Alpert, also known as Baba Ram Dass, Louis Althusser, Roland Barthes, Simone de Beauvoir, William F. Buckley, Truman Capote, Rachel Carson, Noam Chomsky, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Betty Friedan, Milton Friedman, Allen Ginsberg, Václav Havel, Jane Jacobs, Ken Kesey, Timothy Leary, Norman Mailer, Marshall McLuhan, Arthur Miller, Michael Novak, Bertrand Russell, Carl Sagan, John Paul Sartre, Susan Sontag, Hunter S. Thompson, Alan Watts, Tom Wolfe, Samir Rochtori.
Writers:
Edward Albee, Edward Albee, Isaac Asimov, Paul Avery, J. G. Ballard, Amiri Baraka, Gwendolyn Brooks, Basil Bunting, Anthony Burgess, William S. Burroughs, Joseph Campbell, Truman Capote, Carlos Castaneda, Malay Rochtori, Arthur C. Clarke, Gregory Corso, Noel Coward, R. Crumb, Philip K. Dick, Jules Feiffer, Louise Fitzhugh, Paul Goodman, Seamus Heaney, Robert A. Heinlein, Joseph Heller, Frank Herbert, S. E. Hinton, Ken Kesey, Jack Kerouac, John Knowles, Philip Larkin, Harper Lee, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Arthur Miller, Sylvia Plath, Norman Podhoretz, Thomas Pynchon, Jean Rhys, J. D. Salinger, Charles M. Schulz, Dr. Seuss, Terry Southern, John Steinbeck, Tom Stoppard, Hunter S. Thompson, Gore Vidal, Kurt Vonnegut.
Visual artists, painters and sculptors:
Francis Bacon, Joubert, Walter Darby Bannard, Arthur Barrio, Joseph Beuys, Peter Blake, Larry Bell, Linda Benglis, Louise Bourgeois, Joan Brown, Anthony Caro, John Chamberlain, Dan Christensen, Chrissa, Christo, Eduardo Chillida, Bruce Conner, Joseph Cornell, R. Crumb, Gene Davis, Ronald Davis, J. DeFeo, Richard D. Bencorn, Marcel Duchamp, Marisol Escobar, Jules Feiffer, Dan Flavin, Sam Francis, Helen Frankenthaler, Red Grooms, Mimi Gross, Philip Guston, Grace Hartigan, Michael Heiser, Al Held, Eva Hess, David Hockney, Hans Hofmann, Robert Indiana, Al Jaffe, Jackson, Jasper Johns, Donald Judd, Alan Capro, Alex Katz, Jack Kirby, Ellsworth Kelly, Elaine de Kooning, Willem de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Ronnie Landfield, Stan Lee, Sol LeWitt, Roy Lichtenstein, Morris Louis, Robert Mangold, Bryce Marden, Agnes Martin, Peter Max, Joan Mitchell, Robert Morris, Robert Motherwell, Henry Moore, Bruce Norman, Manuel Neary, Louise Nevelson, Barnett Newman, Kenneth Noland, Claes Oldenburg, Jules Olitsky, Namjoon Paik, Nkita Saintful, Larry Poons, Robert Rauschenberg, Bridget Riley, Larry Rivers, James Rosenquist, Mark Rothko, Robert Ryman, Lucas Amaras, George Siegel, Richard Serra, David Smith, Tony Smith, Robert Smithson, Frank Stella, Jim Steranko, Clifford Still, Daniel Spoeri, Mark D. Suvero, Osamu Tezuka, Paul Thek, Jean Tingley, Ernest Trover, Richard Tultle, C. Twombly, Wolf Vostell, Andy Warhol, John Wesley, Tom Wesselman, Hannah Week, Peter Young, Larry Zox.
Sports figures.
Muhammad Ali, Alan Ball, Jr., Gordon Banks, Chuck Bednarik, George Best, Jim Brown, Matt Busby, Billy Cannon, Will Chamberlain, Bobby Charlton, Jack Charlton, Alfredo Di Stefano, Eusebio, Giacinto Facchetti, Garinka, Jimmy Greaves, Jeff Hurst, Jimmy Johnston, Dennis Law, Mickey Mantle, Tommy Mason, Willie Mays, Bobby Moore, Joe Namath, Peel, Martin Peters, Alf Ramsey, Buddy Rogers, Bill Russell, Bill Shankly, Nobby Stiles, Johnny Unitas, Lev Yashin, Jackie Robinson.
Additional notable worldwide events.
Manson murders took place between 8th and 10th August 1969, which was the deaths of Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, along with several others in the Tate House. Killed on August 9, Rosemary LaBianca and Lino LaBianca. Canada celebrated its 100th anniversary of Confederation in 1967 by hosting Expo 67, the World's Fair, in Montreal, Quebec. During the anniversary celebrations, French President Charles de Gaulle visited Canada, and caused a considerable uproar by declaring his support for Quebecois in
1960s.
The 1960s was a decade that began on January 1, 1960 and ended on December 31, 1969. The 1960s term also refers to an era more often called the 60s, denoting the complex of interrelated cultural and political trends across the globe. This cultural decade is more loosely defined than the actual decade, beginning around 1963 and ending around 1974. The 60s, as they are known in both scholarship and popular culture, is a term used by historians, journalists, and other objective academics. In some cases nostalgically to describe the counterculture and revolution in social norms about clothing, music, drugs, dress, formalities, and schooling. Conservatives denounce the decade as one of irresponsible excess, flamboyance, and decay of social order. The decade was also labeled the swinging 60s because of the fall or relaxation of social taboos, especially relating to racism and sexism, that occurred during this time. The 1960s became synonymous with the new, radical, and subversive events and trends of the period. In Africa, the 1960s was a period of radical political change as 32 countries gained independence from their European colonial rulers. Commentator Christopher Booker described this era as a classical Jungian nightmare cycle, where a rigid culture, unable to contain the demands for greater individual freedom, broke free of the social constraints of the previous age through extreme deviation from the norm. He charts the rise, success, full nightmare and explosion in the London scene of the 1960s. However, this analysis fails to explain the mass nature of the phenomenon. Several nations such as the US, France, Germany and Britain turned to the left in the early and mid-1960s. In the United States, John F. Kennedy, a Keynesian and staunch anti-communist, pushed for social reforms. His assassination in 1963 was a stunning shock. Liberal reforms were finally passed under Lyndon B. Johnson, including civil rights for African Americans and health care for the elderly and the poor. Despite his large-scale Great Society programs, Johnson was increasingly reviled by the New Left at home and abroad. The heavy-handed American role in the Vietnam War outraged student protesters across the globe, as they found peasant rebellion typified by Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara more appealing. For example, American cities began to witness Black Panther Party chapter proliferation, an organization characterized with black nationalist and Maoist undertones, began to offer free health clinics, breakfast programs for schoolchildren, free clothing facilities, busing to prisons with families of incarcerated individuals, and self-defense classes for minorities subjected to police harassment. Africa and surrounding nations, and European, mainland Portugal, scenarios. Unlike other European nations, the Portuguese regime did not leave its African colonies, or the overseas provinces, during the 1950s and 1960s. During the 1960s, various armed independence movements, most prominently led by communist-led parties who cooperated under the CONCP umbrella and pro-US groups, became active in these areas, most notably in Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. During the war, several atrocities were committed by all forces involved in the conflict. The Vietnam War, 1959 to 1975. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam, 1962. By mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963, by the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. The Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. 1966, after 1966 with the draft in place more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam. 1962, by mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963, by the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. In Western Europe and Japan, organizations such as those present at May 1968, the Red Army faction, and the Zhangakure tested liberal democracy's ability to satisfy its marginalized or alienated citizenry amidst post-industrial age hybrid capitalist economies. Italy formed its first left-of-center government in March 1962 with a coalition of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and moderate Republicans. Socialists joined the ruling bloc in December 1963. In Britain, the Labour Party gained power in 1964. In Brazil, João Goulart became president after Jânio Quadros resigned. The assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. upon working with underpaid Tennessee garbage collectors and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the police response towards protesters of the 1968 Democratic National Convention defined politics of violence in the United States.
Politics and wars. Wars.
The Cold War. The Vietnam War, 1959 to 1975. 1961, substantial, approximately 700, American advisory forces first arrive in Vietnam, 1962. By mid-1962, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam had risen from 900 to 12,000. 1963, by the time of U.S. President John F. Kennedy's death there were 16,000 American military personnel in South Vietnam, up from Eisenhower's 900 advisors to cope with rising guerrilla activity in Vietnam. 1964, in direct response to the minor naval engagement known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident which occurred on August 2, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress, was passed on August 10, 1964. The resolution gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, for the use of military force in Southeast Asia. The Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. 1966, after 1966 with the draft in place more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles to invade southern Cuba with support from U.S. government armed forces, to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. Portuguese Colonial War, 1961–1974, the war was fought between Portugal's military and the emerging nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies. It was a decisive ideological struggle and armed conflict of the Cold War in African, Portuguese Johnson administration subsequently cited the resolution as legal authority for its rapid escalation of U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. 1966, after 1966 with the draft in place more than 500,000 troops were sent to Vietnam by the Johnson administration and college attendance soars. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, an unsuccessful attempt by a CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles to invade southern Cuba with support from U.S. government armed forces, to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. Portuguese Colonial War, 1961–1974, the war was fought between Portugal's military and the emerging nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies. It was a decisive ideological struggle and armed conflict of the Cold War in African, Portuguese Africa and surrounding nations, and European, mainland Portugal, scenarios. Unlike other European nations, the Portuguese regime did not leave its African colonies, or the overseas provinces, during the 1950s and 1960s. During the 1960s, various armed independence movements, most prominently led by communist-led parties who cooperated under the CONCP umbrella and pro-US groups, became active in these areas, most notably in Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea. During the war, several atrocities were committed by all forces involved in the conflict. Pakistan and India went to war in September 1965. Arab-Israeli conflict, early 20th century-present. 6 Days War, June 1967, a war between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Arab states of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria also contributed troops and arms. At the war's end, Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The results of the war affect the geopolitics of the region to this day. 6 Days War, June 1967, a war between Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Arab states of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria also contributed troops and arms. At the war's end, Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The results of the war affect the geopolitics of the region to this day. The Algerian War came to a close in 1962. The Nigeria Civil War began in 1967.
Internal conflicts.
Cultural Revolution in China, 1966–1976, a period of widespread social and political upheaval in the People's Republic of China which was launched by Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China. Mao alleged that liberal bourgeois elements were permeating the party and society at large and that they wanted to restore capitalism. Mao insisted that these elements be removed through post-revolutionary class struggle by mobilizing the thoughts and actions of China's youth, who formed Red Guards groups around the country. The movement subsequently spread into the military, urban workers, and the party leadership itself. Although Mao himself officially declared the Cultural Revolution to have ended in 1969, the power struggles and political instability between 1969 and the arrest of the Gang of Four in 1976 are now also widely regarded as part of the revolution. The troubles in Northern Ireland began with the rise of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s. The conflict continued into the later 1990s. The Compton's cafeteria riot occurred in August 1966 in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. This incident was one of the first recorded transgender riots in United States history, preceding the more famous 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City by 3 years. The Stonewall riots occurred in June 1969 in New York City. The Stonewall riots were a series of spontaneous, violent demonstrations against a police raid that took place in the Stonewall Inn, in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. They are frequently cited as the first instance in American history when people in the homosexual community fought back against a government-sponsored system that persecuted sexual minorities, and they have become the defining event that marked the start of the gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. The May 1968 student and worker uprisings in France, mass socialist or communist movement in most European countries, particularly France and Italy, with which the student-based New Left was able to forge a connection. The most spectacular manifestation of this was the May Student Revolt of 1968 in Paris that linked up with a general strike of 10 million workers called by the trade unions, and for a few days seemed capable of overthrowing the government of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle went off to visit French troops in Germany to check on their loyalty. Major concessions were won for trade union rights, higher minimum wages and better working conditions. University students protested in the hundreds of thousands against the Vietnam War in London, Paris, Berlin and Rome. In Eastern Europe, students also drew inspiration from the protests in the West. In Poland and Yugoslavia they protested against restrictions on free speech by communist regimes. The Tlatelolco massacre was a government massacre of student and civilian protesters and bystanders that took place during the afternoon and night of October 2, 1968, in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in the Tlatelolco section of Mexico City.
Coups.
Prominent coups d'état of the decade included: in 1963,